At 10:15 in the morning on April 9, 1943, Captain Alexander Pokryshkin climbed into the cockpit of his Bell P-39 Airacobra at a forward airbase near Krymskaya in southern Russia. The ground crews stepped back as the Allison engine came alive, the propeller spinning into a metallic blur. For Pokryshkin, this flight would mark the beginning of something few could have imagined: the rise of a rejected American fighter into one of the deadliest weapons of the Soviet Air Force. The story of the P-39 is one of misjudgment, adaptation, and survival. It began not in Russia, but in the United States, in the late 1930s, when the world's air forces were racing to design the next generation of high-performance fighters. The birth of the Airacobra. Bell Aircraft's engineers came up with something radical. The XP-39 prototype, first flown in 1938, placed its engine behind the pilot, driving the propeller through a long shaft running under the cockpit floor. This allowed a powerful 37mm cannon to fire through the propeller hub, a fearsome concept at the time. The prototype also carried a turbocharger, giving it exceptional high-altitude performance. When test pilots first flew the XP-39, it reached almost 390 miles per hour at 20,000 feet, numbers that promised a first-class interceptor. But what came next would change everything. A fatal decision. In 1939, the U.S. Army Air Corps sent the prototype for aerodynamic testing. Engineers noticed that the turbocharger installation created excess drag. Bell Aircraft proposed a solution: remove the turbocharger entirely, replace it with a simpler supercharger, and save weight. It was a decision made for convenience, and it destroyed the fighter's future. Without its turbocharger, the P-39's performance dropped dramatically above 15,000 feet. By 20,000 feet, it could barely climb at all. For the Western Allies, who needed aircraft to escort bombers flying at 25,000 feet or higher, this was unacceptable. Rejected by the West. When the Royal Air Force received its first export versions, called the P-400, they tested them and quickly refused to keep them. British pilots complained that the aircraft was unstable, sluggish at altitude, and dangerously prone to entering flat spins. With the engine placed behind the pilot, the center of gravity shifted backward as ammunition was fired from the nose. Several test pilots barely survived spin recoveries. American pilots in the Pacific soon echoed those concerns. In 1942, P-39s and P-400s deployed to defend New Guinea and Guadalcanal. They looked sleek and modern, but when Japanese bombers appeared at 20,000 feet, the American pilots could do little but watch them pass overhead. The P-39 couldn't climb fast enough. When it did reach altitude, it lost power so badly that Japanese Zeros could easily outturn and outclimb it. Lieutenant Evans Stevens, one of the early Airacobra pilots, later said the aircraft felt like flying through mud above 15,000 feet. The 37mm cannon, while powerful on paper, jammed constantly. It fired slowly, its shells dropped in heavy arcs, and in the humid jungles of the Pacific, maintenance crews struggled to keep it operational. By the end of 1942, the P-39 had earned nicknames like Iron Dog and Cobra Coffin. Only one American pilot, Lieutenant William Fiedler, became an ace flying the type. He shot down 5 Japanese aircraft before being killed on the ground in an accident. To most American and British squadrons, the Airacobra was a failure. By 1943, it was being replaced by P-38s, P-47s, and P-51s. But its story was far from over. A new home in the East. Thousands of Airacobras were still rolling off American production lines under the Lend-Lease program, military aid sent to U.S. allies. While the British refused more P-39s, the Soviet Union accepted them eagerly. When the first shipments arrived by Arctic convoys in late 1941, Soviet test pilots already knew what Western pilots thought of the fighter. They expected disappointment, but the Soviet Union's war was not the same as Britain's or America's. On the Eastern Front, combat rarely took place above 15,000 feet. German bombers and Stuka dive bombers attacked from low and medium altitudes. Fighters clashed over tank columns, supply lines, and frontline trenches, not high above the clouds. In that environment, the Airacobra's weaknesses vanished, and its hidden strengths came alive. A perfect match for the Eastern Front. During the first Soviet test flights, pilots quickly discovered that below 12,000 feet, the P-39 was a completely different machine. It accelerated hard, rolled sharply, and turned tight. It was faster than most Soviet fighters at those altitudes. And it had something no Soviet aircraft could match: a reliable radio. To the Red Air Force, this was revolutionary. Most Soviet fighters had radios that barely worked, if they had any at all. The P-39's SCR-522 radio let pilots talk clearly across the sky, coordinate tactics, and respond instantly to ground controllers. For the first time, Soviet formations could act as a single coordinated force, not scattered individuals. The aircraft's heavy nose-mounted cannon and machine guns also fit Soviet tactics perfectly. They fought close, within a few hundred meters, and fired short, accurate bursts. The slow-firing 37mm cannon was ideal at that range. A single hit could destroy a bomber or tear apart a Messerschmitt's wing. Soviet mechanics quickly modified the aircraft further. They removed the small .30 caliber wing guns to save weight and improve roll rate. They adjusted control cables, improved cold weather starting, and modified oxygen systems. Each adjustment made the Airacobra more suited for Russian battlefields, faster to roll, easier to maintain, and deadlier in combat. The Alaska-Siberia Lifeline. Getting these aircraft to Russia was a journey of its own kind of heroism. From Bell's factory in Wheatfield, New York, the P-39s flew north to Great Falls, Montana, then across Alaska. There, Soviet ferry pilots took over and flew them across the Bering Sea, alone, in single-seat fighters, through some of the worst weather on Earth. The route was called ALSIB, the Alaska-Siberia Air Route. Storms could appear in minutes. Temperatures dropped so low that fuel froze and oil turned solid. If a pilot's engine failed over the icy water, there was no rescue. Many never made it. Those who did became legends in their own right, delivering thousands of aircraft that would later fight above Stalingrad, Kursk, and the Dnieper River. Pokryshkin and the Dear Little Cobra. Captain Alexander Pokryshkin was already an accomplished ace when his unit, the 16th Guards Fighter Regiment, received its first Airacobras in early 1943. He had nearly 20 victories flying Soviet-built fighters, but he immediately recognized that the P-39 was something special. Where others saw an odd American machine, he saw a weapon that could change the air war. Pokryshkin spent weeks studying the aircraft, testing its limits, and designing new tactics. He realized its radio and low-altitude speed could allow entirely new formations, precise, layered, and flexible. He called one of his innovations the bookshelf formation. Fighters were arranged at different altitudes, stacked like shelves. Each layer protected the one below. If an enemy dove through one level, another intercepted from above. It required constant radio communication, and the P-39 made it possible. He also worked with newly arrived ground radar teams to coordinate interceptions. Controllers guided Airacobras toward German formations even before they were seen, allowing Soviet pilots to strike from perfect positions. First Blood. On April 9, 1943, Pokryshkin flew his first combat mission in the Airacobra. His flight of 8 aircraft intercepted German Messerschmitts attacking Soviet Lag-3s near Krimskaya. Pokryshkin rolled in from altitude, aimed carefully, and opened fire. The 37mm shells struck the enemy fighter's fuselage and engine. It exploded in midair. His first victory in the Airacobra. 3 days later, he shot down 4 more Messerschmitt Bf-10-9s in a single battle over the Kuban region. Using his bookshelf tactics and the radio network, his formation moved like a single organism, one covering the other, never breaking contact. Between April 9th and April 30th, 1943, Pokryshkin claimed 12 victories in his P-39. His comrades began to believe this American machine might truly be their savior. The turning point. On April 29, 1943, came one of the most famous engagements of the war. 8 Airacobras of the 16th Guards Regiment, including Pokryshkin himself, were guided by radar toward a massive German formation. Dozens of Junkers Ju-87 Stukas, escorted by Messerschmitt Bf-109s. Pokryshkin divided his force. 2 fighters to occupy the escorts, 6 to dive straight into the bomber formation. In a matter of minutes, the sky became chaos. Soviet pilots made repeated slashing attacks, diving through the German bombers again and again. When the smoke cleared, 12 German aircraft were down. Pokryshkin alone claimed 5. Not one Airacobra was lost. The results stunned Soviet command. Here was a fighter once dismissed as a failure, now outperforming everything in the Soviet inventory.
Pokryshkin was awarded the Hero of the Soviet Union, the country's highest honor. By mid-1943, he was promoted to major, flying a new P-39N with the number 100 painted in white on its fuselage. He would fly that aircraft for the rest of the war.
As the months passed, more Soviet aces joined the growing list of Airacobra champions. Grigory Rechkalov, Pokryshkin's close friend and wingman, became another master of the type. Despite suffering a serious leg injury earlier in the war, and even hiding his colorblindness from doctors, he went on to score more than 50 victories in P-39s. To their units, the aircraft became affectionately known as Kobrushka, Dear Little Cobra. Some called it Kobrastachka, a mix of cobra and swallow. They trusted it. They loved it. It could take hits, roll fast, and bring its pilot home even with damage. Its thick armor around the cockpit saved countless lives. The reasons for its success in Soviet hands were simple but profound. First, altitude. The P-39's engine produced its best power between 5,000 and 15,000 feet, exactly the altitudes of most Eastern Front battles. Second, tactics. Soviet pilots favored aggressive, close-range engagements. They didn't need to chase high-flying bombers. They needed a strong, stable gun platform that could strike fast and hard. Third, adaptation. Soviet mechanics were not bound by rigid technical orders. They modified what needed to be modified, without waiting for factory approval. They optimized the P-39 in the field, turning a flawed Western machine into a perfect Eastern one. Finally, communication. The aircraft's radio allowed true team tactics, something the Luftwaffe had mastered early in the war, but which the Soviets had struggled to match. Now, they could coordinate like never before. By late 1943, Luftwaffe reports began noting a disturbing trend. Soviet fighter formations were becoming more disciplined, more aggressive, and harder to surprise. German pilots began describing encounters with American-built fighters that attacked in coordinated groups with heavy nose armament and excellent radio discipline. They were talking about the Airacobra. Between 1942 and 1945, the Soviet Union received more than 4,700 P-30s, more than any other Allied nation. It became one of the most widely used foreign fighters in Soviet service. Pokryshkin ended the war with 59 confirmed victories, almost all in the Airacobra. Rechkalov scored 56. Together, they became two of the top Allied aces of the entire conflict, both flying a plane the West had thrown away. After the war, the Airacobra faded into history in the West. In American museums and documentaries, it's remembered as a curiosity, a fighter that never quite lived up to its potential. But in Russia, its story became legendary. For the pilots who fought in it, the Airacobra wasn't a failed design. It was a loyal companion that turned the tide in the air war over the Eastern Front. They remembered how it rolled sharply through the thin smoke of battle, how its cannon roared like thunder, and how its radios carried the voices of comrades through the chaos. They remembered the long journey from American factories to frozen Siberian airfields, the ferry pilots who never came back, and the mechanics who worked through the night to keep them flying. The P-39 had begun its life as a misunderstood machine, rejected by its makers, dismissed by its allies, and left for dead. But in the hands of Soviet pilots, it found purpose. It found redemption. And it became a symbol of how innovation, adaptation, and courage can transform failure into victory. Today, a few Airacobras still fly. Lovingly restored, their Allison engines still humming behind the pilot's seat. Visitors to Russian museums still see the red stars painted on their wings, and the names of aces who flew them. The story of the Airacobra is not about technology alone. It's about context. How the same machine can fail in one war and triumph in another. For Britain and America, the P-39 was a disappointment. For the Soviet Union, it was a savior. And for history, it remains a reminder that sometimes the weapons that change a war are not the ones we expect, but the ones that find the right hands to wield them.